Peter Hain.
Deputy Speaker, contrary to the Chancellor's mantra, Britain's return to recession was not made in Europe. It was made in Britain by the severe fiscal squeeze that the Chancellor launched nearly 3 years ago. Problems in the Eurozone do spell trouble for the UK economy, of course they do, but he never mentions that Britain is benefiting from the recovery in the USA economy, which accounts for 20% of our trade and which is currently growing 4 times faster than the Eurozone is slowing. Why? Because the USA took the route of economic stimulus and stuck to it. Britain set out on the same path under Labour after the banking crisis, and the economy began to pick up. But the coalition veered off, and as soon as the Tory Lib Dems took office, they turned the road to recovery under Labour into the road to ruin. Cutting too far and too fast means the Chancellor is now missing all his key targets. In the year ending, his target deficit, the cyclically adjusted current deficit as a share of GDP, is twice what he originally said it would be. Next year, the Office for Budget Responsibility expects it to be 4 times what he planned. He's also missing his public sector debt target. Instead of falling to 67% of GDP by 2015-16, the budget has it falling to 85% 2 years later, in 2017-18. A surreal definition of success, debt falling upwards. Salvador Dali would be proud, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Zero growth has also forced the Chancellor to accept higher borrowing targets, over 200 billion higher over 5 years than he planned in 2010. And most of the cuts already announced have yet to hit home. Cuts in austerity, which will continue Britain's economic inertia with still disastrous, scorched earth economics to come. Growth, not cuts, should be the priority. Sadly, there's plenty of spare capacity in the UK economy today, which could easily grow quite quickly for a few years by taking up the slack, with borrowing, the deficit and debt falling. As Jonathan Porters, former Chief Executive of the Cabinet Office, says, a few years of 3% growth, and given the amount of spare capacity in the UK economy, there's no reason that should be infeasible, and much of the problem would simply vanish. Growth is the magic bullet for overcoming our deficit and debt problems.
As the right honourable gentleman says, the cuts haven't yet hit home, which is quite right. Why does he think that they have fuelled this recession?
Because they've driven demand out of the economy. Getting the economy growing again, as I say, is the key to cutting the deficit and stabilising and then bringing down the debt burden. Once the economy is growing again, it will be much easier to deliver any remaining tax rises or spending cuts that may still be necessary. Because as Jonathan Porters again says, jobs will be plentiful, real incomes rising and companies investing again. The Tory charge that it is Labour that would increase borrowing. The answer is yes, in the short term we would, but in order to reduce borrowing in the longer term. Borrowing more today can mean borrowing less tomorrow by getting the economy growing again. President Obama's 2009 stimulus package added to the US federal deficit in the short term, but as US interest rates fell, spending and output rose, and dole queues shortened. As a proportion of America's expanding GDP, her overall deficit has shrunk every year since 2009, contrary to ours. A budget boost that triggered real recovery in Britain today could follow the same pattern, speeding up growth of UK national income, cutting the deficit as a proportion of GDP, and causing the debt burden to fall. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that's what this budget should have been about. But old habits die hard as the coalition partners continue to peddle their big deceit. First, that the entire global banking crisis was caused by Labour, recruiting far too many nurses, doctors, teachers and police officers. The trigger for the world financial collapse, the subprime mortgage defaults in the USA, was all Labour's fault. The second big deceit is their claim that today's public sector deficit was caused by excessive Labour spending. That, to quote the utterances of almost every Conservative MP, as if on a dreary loop tape, too much Labour borrowing led to too much national debt, and so the cuts were all Labour's fault. They never admit the truth. They never say why, if spending was out of control, if it was so wildly excessive, why the Chancellor in September 2007, committed a Tory government to matching Labour's public spending plans for the next 3 years, up to 2010. He knew only too well that Labour's spending was affordable, or he wouldn't have signed up to it. They never acknowledged that until the global banking crisis, British government debt was low, below that of France, Germany, the USA and Japan, lower than when we took office from the Tories in 1997. 10 years of steady economic growth under Labour allowed us to pay down debt by the equivalent of 90 billion today, saving taxpayers some 3 billion a year in interest payments. We did fix the roof while the sun was shining. Between 1997 and 2007, annual Labour borrowing averaged only 1/3 of annual borrowing by the Thatcher and John Major governments. This is the fourth dreadful budget by a dreadful government. It's the same old story from the same old Tories. Budget day blues for Britain. The Chancellor's playing a peculiar game of leapfrog with himself. Every budget brings worse news. Every autumn statement confirms that things are worse than expected. They're failing on growth, failing on improving living standards, and failing on their debt borrowing and deficit targets. They've got to make way for Labour.
Richard Graham.